The newspapers had a field day during the war between the states, not just with the slavery debate, but with their reporting of Northern troop movements in their newspapers. Sherman was here voicing the feelings of many Federal commanders, as he probably was when, having been informed that 3 journalists had been killed by an exploding shell, he exclaimed, "Good! Now we shall have news from hell before breakfast." Honorable Treachery, A History of U.S. Intelligence, Espionage, and Covert Action from the American Revolution to the CIA by G.J.A. O'Toole, New York, The Atlantic Monthly Press, 1991, from footnote 18 on page 132, quoting from American Journalism, A History of Newspapers in the U.S. through 260 years by Frank L. Mott, New York, Macmillan, 1950, page 337. During the Lincoln Conspiracy Tribunal, there was a great deal of pushback against the federal government for wanting to hang a woman for the first time, and both Northerners and Southerners joined together in protesting against sending Mary Surratt to the gallows, insisting that it would make the Union government appear to be relentless and cruel, which is precisely why they did it. And they made sure that her public hanging was well photographed, and that those pictures were widely disseminated by the newspapers in order to send the unmistakable message that the new Union government meant business. John Wilkes Booth had been able to travel around during the war, and he could carry opium around by the suitcase full, and George Atzerodt and John Surratt had been able to transport it across the lines into the suffering South. John Wilkes Booth may have remained just a blowhard boasting about wanting to kill Lincoln, except that Powell emboldened him, and Powell had learned to be ruthless from one of the worst war criminals to ever have profited from the horror of war. John Wilkes Booth had started on the stage when he was 17 years old, and in 1855 he'd been playing the Earl of Richmond in Shakespeare's Richard III in Baltimore. And from there, Booth went to Philadelphia for a season and then joined a stock theater company in Petersburg, Virginia, up the Appomattox River from Newport News. The Earl of Richmond that Booth played in Richard III had offered shelter to all the king's enemies, and he'd raised an army to kill the evil King Richard III, and after becoming the king as Henry VII, the Earl of Richmond would marry the daughter of the previous enemy king, uniting the warring sides in England's Civil War. The kicker was that in Richard III, the Earl of Richmond had personally killed the tyrant king, Richard III, and he killed him in the final days of the war. And the first time Richmond spoke in Richard III, he said, "Fellows in arms and my most loving friends, bruised underneath the yoke of tyranny, thus far into the bowels of the land have we marched on without impediment, and here is but 1 day's march. In God's name cheerly on, courageous friends, to reap the harvest of perpetual peace by this one bloody trial of sharp war. All for our advantage, then in God's name march. True hope is swift and flies with swallows' wings. Kings it makes, gods and meaner creatures kings." Richard III, Act 5, Scene 2. The Earl of Richmond made a speech before the final battle that used the word tyrant 3 times and included the lines, "God and our good cause fight upon our side. Those whom we fight against had rather have us win than him they follow. For what is he they follow? Truly, gentlemen, a bloody tyrant and a homicide, one raised in blood and one in blood established, one that hath ever been God's enemy. Then, if you fight against God's enemy, God will in justice ward you as his soldiers. If you do sweat to put a tyrant down, you sleep in peace, the tyrant being slain. Then in the name of God and all these rights, advance your standards, draw your willing swords. For me the ransom of my bold attempt shall be this cold corpse on the earth's cold face, but if I thrive, the gain of my attempt, the least of you shall share his part thereof. Sound, drums and trumpets, boldly and cheerfully. God and St. George, Richmond and victory." Richard III, Act 5, Scene 3. Powell especially liked hearing the Richmond and Victory part, having seen that devastated town that had caused him to desert from the army, and the final speech in Richard III belonged to Booth's Earl of Richmond, a call for an end to the Civil War, along with his declaration of imminent marriage to his beloved. At the end of the play, John Wilkes Booth stood triumphant, the hero that had brought peace to the kingdom by killing the evil king, and he was surrounded by his admirers as the curtain fell at the conclusion of his final speech, that was 3 times as long as this excerpt. "Smile heaven upon this fair conjunction that long have frowned upon their enmity. What traitor hears me and says not amen? England hath long been mad and scarred herself. The brother blindly shed the brother's blood. The father rashly slaughtered his own son. The son compelled been butcher to the sire. All with treason wound this fair land's peace. Now civil wounds are stopped. Peace lives again, that she may long live here. God say amen." Richard III, Act 5, Scene 5. In 1858, Booth had played Horatio to his brother Edwin's Hamlet. And by the end of the decade, John Wilkes Booth had been earning over $20,000 a year, when the average yearly salary for a good workman was $500. Booth began touring in 1860, and he traveled between New York, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, and New Orleans. And he also played in the South, but after the war began, his engagements were only in the northern states or border states. Booth was being heralded as a good talent with a great future, and he was especially popular with women, and hundreds of photos of him were carried in the pockets of thousands of women, and his sister said that Booth had been using his position to smuggle quinine into the Gulf states to treat malaria. John Wilkes Booth had been on tour to various theaters in 1863, and in April he was in Washington, D.C. to play both Hamlet and Richard III, and he had, quote, taken the city by storm and was, quote, a star of first magnitude. But the critics loved him less for his talent than for his outspoken opposition to the Union. In the summer of 1863, Booth played in Ohio and then toured New England, and he continued playing at numerous theaters throughout 1864, coming to Washington, D.C. for an engagement at Ford's Theater on the 9th of November in 1864. The only time all 3 Booth brothers worked together was that month, when they did Shakespeare's Julius Caesar in New York on the 25th of November, and John Wilkes played the lover Mark Antony, while Edwin played Brutus, and Junius played Cassius. And during the performance of that Julius Caesar at the Winter Garden Theater, where Edwin was the manager, squads of Confederates were racing around the city trying to burn down New York, and they set fire to the building behind the Winter Garden Theater, with which it shared a common wall, and the play was interrupted by the clanging of the bells on the fire engine. Edwin calmly stepped forward and assuaged the audience not to flee, and his Brutus had been in the orchard, debating with himself whether or not to kill Caesar, when the fire engine had arrived. After that single performance, Edwin would perform Hamlet on the New York stage until he was forced to lay low for a year after his brother assassinated President Lincoln. And Edwin would start playing Hamlet again in 1866 until March of 1867, when a fire set under the stage burned the entire Winter Garden Theater to the ground. When John Wilkes Booth had come to Washington, D.C. again in January of 1865, he'd been meeting with his school friend Samuel B. Arnold at Powell's girlfriend's house in Baltimore. And Arnold had been discharged from the Confederate Army in 1864 for health reasons, and had taken a job at Old Point Comfort near Newport News. Arnold and Dr. Mudd were sentenced to life in prison for complicity with the Lincoln conspirators, but President Johnson pardoned them in 1869, and Arnold had been arrested from his job in Old Point Comfort for his involvement with blockade running. The heart of the entire matter was that John Wilkes Booth had something of a girlfriend named Lucy Hale, with whom he'd been seen in public more and more often at the beginning of 1865, and she was a fan of Abraham Lincoln, but Booth thought he could change her mind about that. In the spring of 1865, Booth had been quarreling with Lucy's father with increasing frequency, and shortly before the assassination, Booth had seen Lucy dancing with Robert Lincoln at the National Hotel. When the war broke out, Lucy's family had moved into the National Hotel, and her father was a senator who hoped that she would marry Robert Lincoln. And the afternoon of the assassination, Booth had seen Lucy studying Spanish with Robert Lincoln and John Hay, and Lucy's father had just been appointed the ambassador to Spain in March, an excellent move by Lincoln to get the promiscuous Lucy away from his 21-year-old son. John Hay was one of Lincoln's closest assistants, and he had a small bedroom in the White House and was one of Lincoln's 2 personal secretaries. And John Hay was said to have had excessive charm and was a very good-looking young man. John Hay had often accompanied the Lincolns to the theater and had chaperoned Robert Lincoln at the bars, and one of Hay's duties was to clash with Mary Lincoln over her personal household expenditures. It was said that Lincoln loved John Hay as a son, and according to Robert Gale, Hay loved Lincoln for, quote, his goodness, patience, understanding, sense of humor, humility, magnanimity, sense of justice, healthy skepticism, resilience and power, love of the common man, and mystical patriotism. John Hay by Robert L. Gale, Boston Twain Publishers, 1978, page 18. John Hay was 2 years older than Lucy, and John Hay and John Wilkes Booth were the same age, and Lucy was 2 years older than Robert Lincoln. Lucy's father had been at the White House in the morning on the 14th of April, and Booth had talked to Lucy before lunch and discussed her father's transfer overseas, and then Booth had dinner with Lucy and her mother at the National Hotel that evening, and exactly at 8 p.m., Booth stood up and recited a line from Hamlet and excused himself to go prevent his beloved from being sent off to Spain. John Hay had also been a favorite of Secretary of State Seward, and had spent more time at Seward's house than at the White House. And at the time of the assassination, Mary Lincoln had been trying to get rid of John Hay, which is why he spent so much time hiding out at the Seward house. Booth may have learned from Robert Lincoln that John Hay was often at Seward's house 1 block away from the White House, and when Lincoln arrived at Ford's Theater without John Hay, Booth's incendiary mood propelled Powell off to the Seward's house to find the usurper of Booth's intended devotion. If Powell had returned without finding John Hay, the plan to kill Lincoln may have been postponed or shelved altogether, but no, there would have been no stopping the assassination that night because all the muses had lined themselves up. In the late afternoon, General Grant and his wife were riding in a carriage on their way to the train station at 6th and B Street, and John Wilkes Booth came galloping down the road, then pulled up short, turned around and confronted Grant with a hostile stare, and then continued down the road. General Grant and his wife had been staying at the Willard Hotel at 12th and Pennsylvania, 2 blocks east of the Kirkwood, and John Wilkes Booth had shown up that day with 3 men in the dining room of the Willard and sat at the table next to Mrs. Grant while she was having lunch with another general's wife. And the men had glared at her, and while she didn't recognize Booth, she told her husband that the man who had confronted them in the carriage on the road to the train station and one of the men in the dining room were the same person. That morning, Grant had attended a cabinet meeting at the White House, and he had accepted an invitation to Ford's Theater that night, but his wife had declined later because she wanted to go back to their rented house in Burlington, New Jersey, near the Delaware River. Grant sent a note to that effect back to the White House, but Lincoln had already sent someone to the theater saying he would be there with the Grants, and so the wheels in Booth's mind had begun to spin. When Lincoln was killed hours later, the police immediately asked the stagehands tasked with holding Booth's getaway horse what they knew, and the stagehands were able to tell the police from whence Booth's horse had come. Upon their arrival, the stablemaster at 6th and C Street told the police that he'd rented out 2 horses to 2 men at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and those 2 men had instructed him that the horses were to be picked up around 9 p.m., and the stablemaster named the 2 men as John Wilkes Booth and Lewis Powell. Booth had begun playing Romeo and Juliet in Washington, D.C. in January of 1865, and had then begun arguing with Lucy's father, and when Booth bade farewell to Lucy at 8 p.m. after dinner at the National, he quoted from Hamlet while kissing her hand, and said, "Nymph, in thy orisons be all thy sins remembered." That line was at the end of Hamlet's To Be or Not to Be speech in Scene 1 of Act 3, and the question in that speech was whether or not conscience, quote, "conscience doth make cowards of us all," close quote, when, quote, "enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn awry and lose the name of action," close quote. Money for Booth had been no object, and he had legions of admirers willing to shelter him, and scores of friends willing to accept his money had the reward from Johnson gone south, and when he returned his morning horse at 4 p.m., meeting Powell to reserve horses for later, the only discussion at the stable had been about John Hay helping Lucy learn Spanish at the National Hotel that morning. Had the little boy named Peanut of African descent not been able to tell the police from whence Booth's getaway horse had come, since it was not Booth's regular horse, they never would have discovered Powell's name, and Powell would have remained just another Confederate raider skilled in deception and damage and disguise. Southerners prided themselves on gallantry and romance and were deeply involved in matters of honor, and it's possible that Powell had risen to the occasion of taking it upon himself to intervene in the challenge that had gripped his friend John Wilkes Booth that day, and Powell may have pushed his way into the Seward house with the sole intention of giving John Hay a stern warning to keep away from Lucy Hale. But Powell flipped out when the snobby Yankees started questioning him and blocking his way, and Powell just lost it, which would be consistent with his declaring, I'm mad," as he ran out of the house, the sort of insanity that had been a virtue within the ranks of Mosby's irregulars. The original plan had been that Powell would kill both Grant and John Hay in the presidential box with the Whitney revolver, while Booth killed Lincoln with his Derringer, and they would escape out the backstage door, ride to the Kirkwood Hotel, and have George Atzerodt return the horses while they waited in the room at the Kirkwood for President Johnson to reward them in the morning. But John Hay had not arrived at Ford's Theater with the Lincolns, and neither had Grant. Just then, as if sent from the gods at the final hour, Harold had entered the picture with his morphine delivery to the Seward house, so Powell could be dispatched to Secretary Seward's residence to take care of John Hay, while Booth was left at the Star Tavern to wait for his return, because Powell had ridden off with the .44 six-shooter, leaving Booth with only the single-shot Derringer. Booth waited in the Star Tavern for Powell to return with the good news that his romantic rival was deterred, but instead the minutes ticked by and the play was nearing its end, which Booth could hear through the open windows, and since Powell had not yet returned, John Wilkes Booth acted on his destructive compulsion without knowing whether or not there would be any more interference from John Hay about Booth's obsession. And his last words were not useless, useless, but Lucy, Lucy. John Wilkes Booth died right before his 27th birthday with a photo of Lucy in his pocket. And after Booth shot Lincoln and jumped down onto the stage, he brandished a knife and fired off a line from the assassination scene in Julius Caesar. And Booth really thought that Lincoln had it coming because for years the newspapers had been calling Lincoln a tyrant. Some historians thought that Booth was jealous of Robert Lincoln for having such a successful father, while his own father had abandoned a wife and child back in England. So the marriage of Booth's mother may not have been legitimate and rendered the circumstances of the birth of John Wilkes and his brothers as questionable, and that would explain his affinity for Shakespearean drama in general and the name of the city of Richmond in particular. Henry VIII's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, the only one of Henry VIII's out-of-wedlock children he recognized as his own, had been given the title of the Duke of Richmond, made possible by his grandfather, the Earl of Richmond, who had killed Richard III and become the new king, Henry VII, which is what Shakespeare's play Richard III was about. And the title had been elevated from the Earl of Richmond to a dukedom just for Henry VIII's illegitimate son. Charles, too, would have an out-of-wedlock son, one of 12 from 7 different women, and he was named the Duke of Richmond in 1675, and Richmond County in Virginia and Staten Island in New York were named after that Duke of Richmond, and the seat of the Duke of Richmond was the House of Goodwood, where a secret private airport would be built during Hitler's war. The Church of England had refused to acknowledge the out-of-wedlock son of Charles II and had given the crown to his brother James II, who had been the Duke of York when New York was named after him, and the colony of Jamestown had been named after his grandfather James I. The county of Richmond was across the Potomac from Maryland, and the city of Richmond was 40 miles inland from the first British colony in America at Jamestown, and Jamestown was 40 miles up the James River from Old Point Comfort, and it had been in the summer of 1619 at Old Point Comfort that the first African slaves had been landed on American soil. After performing an autopsy on John Wilkes Booth aboard the ironclad Montauk, an autopsy that included identification by 10 eyewitnesses who had seen or known Booth, they refrained from taking any photographs that could become icons, and they weighted his corpse and dropped it into the Potomac River to keep the crazy Southerners from turning his bones into sacred relics. Mary Surratt's house had been torn apart by souvenir hunters right away, until the police put a stop to it, and the 4 executed conspirators were buried in graves just in front of the walls inside the arsenal, the military prison compound where they had been held and tried and hung from the gallows. Burying the bodies inside the compound would keep their remains away from the madding public, and Mary Surratt's daughter was demanding the return of her mother's bones, but would be denied for 4 years. 2 years later, the pine coffins were moved to burial vaults inside a locked warehouse, and an anonymous deceased prisoner was added in John Wilkes Booth's place so the military administrators would not be accused of being unchristian for having disposed of his body so cavalierly. 2 years after that, Edwin Booth and Mary Surratt's daughter were given back the remains of their loved ones, and George's family accepted his remains for reburial, and Powell was also laid to rest after some confusion over his whereabouts. Harold's mother and 4 sisters buried him next to his father, who had died at the age of 61 in October of 1864, a widely known and well-respected Mason, and his boy Harold had been introduced to everyone in the Navy Yard as his pride and joy, his beloved only son, who had known all the secret passwords needed to get across the bridge that terrible night when Abraham Lincoln died. Harold thought that Powell was just going to knock on Seward's door to find out if John Hay was there, and Powell's Whitney revolver had misfired, so it must not have been his own weapon, but one hastily lent to him, and neither he nor Booth had the Spencer carbines that John Surratt was storing at the Surratt compound, the guns they called shooting irons, that were repeater rifles, even though the hammer had to be manually recocked after each magazine round was fired. Those guns had been stolen from the Union Army because the Confederates had been unable to manufacture them, and Mary Surratt ordered Lloyd to pick them up from Maryland that afternoon, but Lloyd went to the bar instead because bringing long guns across the bridges was simply too dangerous, and liquor makes you stupid, but not that stupid. The repeater carbines were not delivered to Powell by 8 p.m. as Booth had directed to Mary Surratt before returning his morning horse at 4 p.m., meeting Powell at the stable to get the evening's rental approved, and seeing the Grants on the road in their carriage. And there was not enough time to bring the long guns over by boat, and Powell would put the Whitney revolver up against the forehead of Seward's second son Frederick and pull the trigger, but nothing happened, so Powell beat him unconscious with the weapon, and the owner of that Whitney remains in history anonymous. Booth thought he could get away with killing Lincoln in order to keep his beloved Lucy from being sent overseas, but it wouldn't have made a difference if she remained in America were she continuing to cast her gaze upon John Hay. John Wilkes Booth had been bloviating all day about having seen Lucy with John Hay the morning of the assassination, and when Booth encountered the Grants in their carriage, would General Grant have recognized John Wilkes Booth? Would Grant have ignored the threatening gesture, or would he have turned around and followed Booth, and then watched him from afar and seen him walk from the stables to the National Hotel, where Robert Lincoln may have been greeted by Booth outside the hotel where John Hay had been studying Spanish with Lucy, and Robert Lincoln would be described in many accounts as having joined them? Robert Lincoln had just arrived on the train from Appomattox, where the Grants were preparing to board the train to New Jersey, and perhaps Robert Lincoln ran into Booth on the sidewalk and had been seen there by more people than just the Grants. Booth was acting with impunity because he thought he would be hailed as a hero, and while hiding out for the next 12 days, Booth was shocked to learn from reading the newspapers that even the Confederacy was saddened and dismayed by his actions. Robert Lincoln was serving on Grant's staff and had been present at the signing of the surrender in Appomattox, and his whereabouts since then were always discoverable by the general, and Robert Lincoln begged off going to the theater that night because he was tired from just having traveled back that afternoon from Appomattox, but not tired enough to turn down the Spanish studies. When General Grant got on the train in New Jersey, Garfield had been headed for New York and probably boarded that same train, and perhaps Garfield also had seen Robert Lincoln with Booth and Powell near the stables at 4 p.m., 1 block away from the train station. And Garfield would keep it a secret out of respect for the slain president. Then again, maybe everyone knew, but it stayed quiet about it, manners being what they were in those days, such as on the 11th of November in 1864, when Colonel Mosby wrote a letter to Sheridan proposing a stop to the executions of POWs, and Sheridan had agreed, and Powell may have seen that as a weakness. On that same train platform in 1881, President Garfield would be assassinated in the presence of Robert Lincoln, and President McKinley would be assassinated in 1901 at a fair in Buffalo, New York, while Robert Lincoln stood nearby. And at the end of the day, on the 14th of April in 1865, while Booth was getting ready to kill the president, John Hay had been at the White House drinking whiskey with Robert Lincoln, and they would be brought together to pay their respects at Abraham Lincoln's deathbed. McKinley had served in the final days of the war under both General Hancock and General Sam Carroll, and McKinley had been Carroll's adjutant in those final complicated days before the surrender on the 9th of April at Appomattox Courthouse. And McKinley had gone with Carroll to Washington, D.C., where he served in Hancock's 1st Veterans Corps until they were disbanded in July of 1865, 90 days after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. When the war had broken out, most of Hancock's friends joined the Confederacy, but Hancock had attended West Point and had been in the fighting in the war with Mexico during his 20 years of Army service, so Hancock stayed on the Union side, where he enjoyed considerable rank. Hancock would run for president in 1880 on the Democrat ticket, and narrowly lost to the Republican Garfield, and Garfield was shot at the train station 4 months later, and so goes History Anonymous. When Lincoln was shot, General Grant was called back to Washington, D.C., having gotten only as far as Philadelphia, while Garfield continued on to New York, and Robert Lincoln would resign his commission on the 12th of June, and the guilty verdicts for the Lincoln conspirators were handed down 2 weeks later on the 30th of June. Hancock was appointed the supervisor of the execution of the Lincoln assassination conspirators, and they were hanged on the 7th of July after a thorough military tribunal, and it had been Hancock who was tasked with informing the prisoners that they were to suffer the gallows for the killing of the president. Hancock was posted in Baltimore for a year after hanging the Lincoln conspirators, his tour done under General Grant's direct supervision, and then Hancock was sent away out west to fight Indians. Garfield had thought Lincoln was being too soft on the South, and McKinley was 6 months older than Robert Lincoln and had fought in the Kanawha Valley in the Shenandoah campaign, and McKinley's courage and tactics had been responsible for turning the tide of battle against the Confederates, and the military compound where the Lincoln conspirators were hanged would be renamed Fort Leslie J. McNair in 1946.